Welcome to the Lord of the Dark. This explores the grim logistics of corpse disposal and sanitation in Warhammer 40k's massive hive cities, where billions of humans live stacked in towering urban nightmares. When plagues, wars, or disasters kill millions, the Imperium deploys specialized labor gangs, servitors, and corpse grinder cults to process the dead, often recycling bodies into corpse starch food or industrial materials. The video examines the horrifying bureaucracy of death management, from the administratum clerks who track casualty quotas to the underhive scavengers who profit from the endless tide of human remains. Let's talk about one of the most disturbing yet absolutely essential aspects of life in the Imperium of Man: what happens to the dead in hive cities.
To be a man in such times is to be one amongst untold billions. It is to live in the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable.
This isn't some minor logistical footnote. This is a nightmare of industrial scale that most people never even think about when they imagine the grimdark future. Because when you have billions upon billions of humans crammed into towering urban hellscapes, death doesn't just happen occasionally. It happens constantly, endlessly, in numbers so staggering that the human mind struggles to comprehend them. And the bodies? They don't just disappear. Someone has to deal with them. Something has to be done. If you want to understand just how bleak existence truly is in the 41st millennium, you need to understand the scale of death in hive cities and why traditional burial isn't just impractical. It's physically impossible. Picture a hive city for a moment, not the sanitized version you might see in propaganda posters, but the real thing. We're talking about structures that dwarf anything humanity has ever built in our reality. These aren't cities in any conventional sense. They're artificial mountains of steel, plasteel, and rockcrete that punch through the atmosphere itself, housing populations that make ancient Terra's most crowded metropolises look like quaint villages. A single hive can contain anywhere from 10 billion to over 100 billion human souls, all stacked on top of each other in layers that stretch from the polluted surface wastelands, up through the smog-choked middle habs, and into the gleaming spires where the nobility pretend the horrors below don't exist. Every square meter is claimed, fought over, lived in. There is no empty space. There is no room to breathe, let alone room for the dead. Now think about what death looks like at this scale. Even in peacetime, even without plagues or wars or any of the countless disasters that plague imperial worlds, people die. They die of old age, of industrial accidents, of violence, of malnutrition, of diseases that would be easily treatable if anyone cared enough to provide medicine to the lower levels. Conservative estimates suggest that in a hive of 50 billion inhabitants, natural attrition alone claims millions of lives every single day. Millions. Every day. And that's before you factor in the truly catastrophic events that seem to strike hive worlds with terrifying regularity. A gang war in the underhive might leave tens of thousands dead in a week. A manufactorum explosion could vaporize an entire hab block and everyone in it. A food riot, a cult uprising, a Xenos incursion, a demonic breach. Any of these can push the daily death toll into the tens of millions without even making the planetary news feeds. The numbers are genuinely incomprehensible. Fans have done the math, and it's absolutely horrifying. If a hive city of 40 billion people has even a modest mortality rate of 1% per year, that's 400 million corpses annually. That's over 1 million bodies every single day that need to go somewhere. And remember, these aren't spread out across vast territories like deaths would be on a normal world. These are concentrated in a single structure, often in the most cramped and inaccessible areas where the poorest and most desperate citizens eke out their miserable existences. The underhive alone, that lawless maze of collapsed tunnels and forgotten chambers beneath the functioning city, probably accounts for a disproportionate share of these deaths, and it's precisely the area where organized disposal is most difficult. So why can't they just bury the dead like civilizations have done for thousands of years? The answer is brutally simple. There's nowhere to put them. Hive cities exist because the planets they occupy have been stripped of usable surface area. The land outside the hive walls is typically either industrial wasteland, ash desert, toxic swamp, or terrain so polluted that nothing can survive there without protection. There are no rolling green cemeteries waiting to receive the faithful departed. There are no quiet graveyards where families can visit their ancestors. The very concept of dedicating land to the dead would be considered an obscene waste of resources by imperial administrators who measure everything in terms of productivity and output. Land that could house workers, grow food in hydroponic vaults, or support manufactorum expansion cannot be surrendered to corpses that contribute nothing to the Imperium's endless wars. Even if you could somehow find space for burial, the logistics would be impossible. Imagine trying to transport 1 million bodies per day from the upper, middle, and lower sections of a hive to some designated burial ground. The transit systems are already overwhelmed just moving living workers to their shifts. The elevators and cargo lifts that connect hive levels operate at maximum capacity around the clock. Adding millions of corpses to that daily flow would cause immediate systemic collapse. And that's assuming you could even collect all the bodies in the first place, which you absolutely cannot when they're dying in ventilation shafts, collapsed hab units, flooded sump tunnels, and the countless forgotten corners of a city structure that no one has fully mapped in millennia. Cremation might seem like a solution, and it is used in some circumstances, but it presents its own problems. The sheer energy required to incinerate millions of bodies daily would strain even a hive city's massive power infrastructure. Promethium and other fuels are precious resources earmarked for industry and warfare, not waste disposal. The smoke and ash from mass cremation would add to the already catastrophic pollution levels, potentially rendering entire hab zones uninhabitable. And perhaps most importantly, from the imperial perspective, cremation destroys resources that could otherwise be reclaimed and recycled for the benefit of the living. This is where the true horror of hive city death management begins to reveal itself. The Imperium doesn't see corpses as former citizens deserving dignity and rest. It sees them as raw materials temporarily shaped like people. Every body represents calories that could feed the hungry, chemicals that could fuel industry, and organic matter that could serve 1,000 different purposes in a civilization perpetually starved for resources. When you understand this fundamental truth about how the Imperium views its own citizens as resources to be exploited in life and recycled in death, the systems that evolved to handle mass mortality start to make a terrible kind of sense. They're not designed to honor the dead. They're designed to extract every last ounce of value from human remains before whatever's left gets dumped into the sump or fed to the recycling vats. So you've got this incomprehensible tide of corpses flooding every level of the hive, every single day, without pause, without mercy. But here's the thing about the Imperium. They don't just let chaos reign, even when chaos would honestly be the easier option. No, they document everything. They categorize everything. They file, stamp, record, and archive every single death with the same obsessive bureaucratic fervor they apply to ammunition counts and tithe collections. Welcome to the Administratum's Death Management Division, where the Grim Reaper himself would probably get lost in the paperwork. The Administratum doesn't see corpses as former human beings with lives and stories and people who loved them. They see data points. They see numbers on a ledger that need to balance against population projections, labor quotas, and resource allocation spreadsheets. Every death in a hive city generates what's called a mortality documentation package, which sounds almost clinical until you realize it's basically reducing a human existence to a stack of forms that need 17 different stamps from 12 different departments before the body can be legally processed. And yes, legally processed, because even corpse disposal has regulations, exemptions, and penalty clauses for non-compliance. The clerks who handle this work are a special breed of administratum functionary. They're not the ambitious scribes angling for promotion to planetary governance positions. These are the ones who drew the short straw, the ones assigned to basement offices that smell perpetually of incense, meant to cover something worse, surrounded by cogitator banks that hum with the constant influx of death reports. Their entire existence revolves around mortality statistics, and after a few decades of service, they start seeing patterns in the numbers that would drive most people to madness. They know which hab blocks have suspicious death spikes that suggest gang activity. They know which manufacturum shifts produce more workplace fatalities. They know, in a purely statistical sense, approximately how many people will die in their sector tomorrow, and they've already prepared the forms. The categorization system itself is a masterwork of imperial bureaucracy in all its terrible glory. Deaths aren't just recorded. They're classified according to cause, location, social status, potential resource value, and spiritual condition. A worker who dies in a manufacturum accident gets different paperwork than someone who succumbs to hive plague. A noble's death triggers an entirely separate documentation chain that involves the ecclesiarchy, the local arbites, and probably 3 different inheritance tribunals. Meanwhile, an underhive ganger who gets shanked over a food ration might not get any official documentation at all, just a tally mark in the unregistered mortality column that the administratum uses to estimate population fluctuations in zones they don't actually control. The spiritual condition classification is particularly grim because the administratum works closely with the ecclesiarchy to determine whether the deceased died in a state of imperial grace or whether their death carries potential heretical contamination. Deaths during demon incursions, chaos cult activity, or unexplained psychic phenomena get flagged with special seals that route the documentation to inquisitorial monitoring channels. The clerks who handle these files don't ask questions. They've been trained not to. They just stamp the forms, make the appropriate copies, and try not to think about why certain death reports come with orders to destroy all biological remains through sanctified cremation rather than standard processing. There's a hierarchy to the dead in the administratum's eyes, and it's brutally pragmatic. High-value citizens, skilled artisans, sanctioned psychers, administratum officials themselves get priority processing and proper documentation that ensures their remains are handled according to whatever status their position afforded them in life. Average hivers, the countless billions of workers and hab-dwellers who form the human substrate of imperial civilization, get bulk processing documentation that groups them into batches for efficient handling. And then there are the non-persons, the undocumented masses living in the lawless depths who technically don't exist in any imperial record, whose deaths are estimated rather than counted, extrapolated from population density algorithms rather than actual reports. The quota system is where it gets truly dystopian, even by Imperium standards. Each sector of a hive city has expected mortality rates calculated years in advance based on population projections, industrial hazard assessments, and historical data. When actual deaths exceed projections, it triggers resource reallocation requests. When deaths fall below projections, it raises red flags about potential population undercounting or unauthorized survival rates that might indicate unsanctioned medical care or, emperor forbid, mutation-enhanced longevity. The administratum doesn't celebrate when fewer people die than expected. They investigate, because deviation from projected mortality is deviation from the plan, and the plan exists for reasons that transcend individual human survival. So the administratum has its endless ledgers and its armies of scribes tracking every corpse with obsessive precision. But paperwork doesn't move bodies. Paperwork doesn't drag bloated remains out of collapsed hab blocks or scrape what's left of industrial accident victims off manufactorum floors. For that, you need hands. Lots of hands. And in the hive cities of the Imperium, those hands belong to some of the most overlooked yet absolutely essential workers in human civilization, the corpse guilds and sanctioned labor gangs whose entire existence revolves around the collection, transportation, and processing of the dead. These aren't volunteers. They're not motivated by civic duty or religious calling, though some certainly develop their own twisted philosophies to cope with the work. No, Corpse Guild membership is typically hereditary, passed down through generations of families who've known nothing else. Your great-grandfather hauled bodies. Your grandfather hauled bodies. Your father hauled bodies. And now you haul bodies, because that's what your bloodline does, and the Imperium doesn't exactly encourage career changes. The guild system locks people into their professions with iron chains of tradition, legal obligation, and simple economic reality. Where else would you go? What else would you do? You were born knowing the smell of decay, and you'll die still carrying it in your clothes, your skin, your very soul. The structure of these guilds varies wildly from hive to hive, but certain patterns emerge across imperial space. Most operate under charter from the local administratum office, granted official sanction to perform their grim duties in exchange for meeting quotas and maintaining acceptable standards of efficiency. These charters are jealously guarded, fought over, sometimes even killed for, because they represent guaranteed work in a society where employment means survival. A guild without its charter is nothing, just a bunch of unauthorized scavengers who will be arrested, servitorized, or worse, if they're caught handling corpses without proper documentation. Guild hierarchies tend to mirror the social stratification of the hive itself. At the top, you've got the guild masters and senior factors, the ones who negotiate contracts, manage logistics, and maintain relationships with administratum officials. These individuals rarely touch actual corpses anymore. They've ascended beyond the physical labor into the realm of management and politics, living in relative comfort compared to their subordinates, while still bearing the social stigma of their profession. Nobody invites the Corpse Guild master to high society functions, no matter how wealthy he becomes. The taint of death clings to the profession, regardless of how far you rise within it. Below the leadership, you find the various specialized roles that make the guild function. Collectors are the most numerous, organized into teams that patrol assigned territories with their carts, wagons, or whatever conveyances the guild can afford. In wealthier hive sections, they might have actual vehicles, battered trucks, or repurposed cargo haulers. In the lower reaches, they make do with hand-drawn carts, sometimes nothing more than improvised stretchers carried between two workers. The collectors know their routes intimately, every death-prone corner, every spot where bodies tend to accumulate, every cramped passage where someone might crawl to die unnoticed. Then you've got the sorters, workers stationed at collection points who categorize incoming corpses according to administratum requirements. Fresh bodies go one direction, decomposed remains another. Industrial casualties get separated from disease victims. Anyone bearing military insignia or official documentation gets flagged for additional processing. The sorters work fast, their hands moving with practiced efficiency, born from handling thousands upon thousands of dead, their minds deliberately numbed to the horror of what passes through their fingers every single shift. Transporters move the sorted dead from collection points to processing facilities, driving the corpse wagons through hive tunnels and transit corridors, often at night when fewer citizens are around to complain about the smell or the sight of stacked bodies. These routes become grimly familiar, the transporters knowing every shortcut, every checkpoint where bribes might be required, every dangerous stretch where underhive predators might try to raid their cargo for whatever valuables the dead still carry. The labor gangs operate slightly differently from the established guilds. Where guilds represent hereditary professions with centuries of tradition, labor gangs are often conscripted workforces assembled to handle specific situations or supplement guild numbers during high mortality periods. Prisoners, debtors, those who've fallen afoul of imperial law without quite deserving execution, they get pressed into corpse handling duty as a form of punishment or penance. These gangs work under armed supervision, watched by enforcers who ensure they don't slack off, don't steal from the dead more than their unofficial allowance permits, and don't try to escape into the Hive's endless warrens. The relationship between guilds and labor gangs is complicated, often antagonistic. Guild members resent the gangs as competition, as untrained amateurs who lower the perceived value of skilled corpse work. Gang members resent the guilds as privileged insiders, hoarding the better assignments and leaving the most dangerous, most disgusting work for conscripts. Turf disputes happen constantly, sometimes escalating into actual violence in the lawless spaces between hive levels, where neither Arbites nor guild authorities hold sway. What makes this whole system function despite its obvious dysfunction is simple necessity. The dead must be collected. There is no alternative. Every hour a corpse remains uncollected represents disease risk, social unrest, and bureaucratic failure that someone will eventually answer for. So the guilds and gangs keep working, keep hauling, keep feeding the endless machinery of death management that keeps the hive from drowning in its own mortality. So you've got your corpse guilds and your labor gangs, these armies of living workers hauling bodies through the endless corridors of the hive. But here's the brutal truth that everyone in the Imperium understands even if they never say it out loud. Human workers get tired. Human workers get sick. Human workers sometimes just break down and refuse to keep going when they're knee-deep in rotting flesh for the 100th shift in a row. And when you're dealing with casualty numbers that would make planetary governors weep, you can't afford weakness. You can't afford hesitation. You need something that will work without complaint, without rest, without ever stopping to question why it's spending eternity shoveling the dead into processing vats. You need servitors. These lobotomized cyborg laborers are the Imperium's answer to every problem that requires endless, mindless, unquestioning work, and nowhere are they more essential than in the death-processing industries of hive cities. Corpse handler servitors are a specialized breed of these unfortunate creations, modified specifically for the grim task of managing human remains on an industrial scale. Their biological components have been stripped of anything resembling personality or self-awareness, their brains surgically altered to remove all capacity for independent thought, leaving behind only the basic motor functions needed to perform their designated tasks. What remains is a flesh and metal automaton that will grab corpses, transport corpses, and process corpses until its own biological systems finally fail and it joins the very tide of dead it was created to manage. The modifications on these servitors are genuinely disturbing when you stop to think about them. Many have their arms replaced with industrial gripping mechanisms designed to handle bodies in various states of decay without losing their hold. Some feature built-in chemical sprayers that coat everything they touch with preservative agents or sanitizing compounds, creating a constant mist of acrid chemicals wherever they work. Others have their legs replaced with tracked locomotion systems that let them traverse the uneven terrain of collapsed structures and debris-choked corridors without slowing down. Their sensory organs are often enhanced or replaced entirely with augmetic systems that can function in total darkness through thick smoke, or in atmospheric conditions that would blind or choke a normal human. They don't need light, They don't need clean air. They just need corpses to collect. Fan discussions often point out the horrifying irony that many of these servitors were themselves once Hive citizens who died and were deemed suitable for conversion rather than processing into raw materials. The Mechanicus adepts who oversee Servitor production don't waste usable biological components, and a relatively intact corpse with a brain that can still accept basic programming is far too valuable to simply grind into starch. So, the dead are raised to serve in death, spending their posthumous existence handling the remains of others who will eventually join their ranks. It's a cycle that perfectly captures the Imperium's utilitarian approach to human life. You serve the Emperor in life, you serve the Emperor in death, and the distinction between the two states matters far less than whether you're still useful. Beyond individual servitors, the Hive cities deploy entire automated systems designed to handle mass casualties with mechanical efficiency. Corpse conveyor networks run through the industrial levels like metal arteries, moving remains from collection points to processing facilities without requiring direct human involvement at every stage. These conveyor systems can stretch for kilometers, passing through multiple Hive levels and connecting dozens of separate facilities in a single integrated network. Bodies are loaded onto the conveyors at designated intake points, then carried along through a series of automated checkpoints where auger arrays scan them for anything valuable. Cybernetic implants that can be salvaged, identification markers that need to be recorded, or signs of dangerous contamination that require special handling. The larger processing facilities feature massive automated sorting mechanisms that would look right at home in any manufactorum. Mechanical arms guided by simple cogitator programs, separate bodies based on size, condition, and designated processing category. Conveyor splits direct different types of remains to different production lines. Relatively fresh bodies might go to facilities where their biological materials can be efficiently rendered, while badly decomposed remains get shunted toward bulk processing vats, where the distinction between individual corpses ceases to matter. It's assembly line manufacturing applied to human death, and it operates with the same impersonal efficiency as any other imperial industrial process. Some Hive cities have developed what can only be described as corpse harvesting automata, larger servitor vehicles that combine the lobotomized biological control systems with substantial mechanical chassis. These things look like small vehicles with multiple mechanical arms, designed to move through disaster zones and battle sites, collecting bodies far faster than individual servitors could manage. They can carry dozens of corpses at once, their cargo bays designed with drainage systems that handle the inevitable biological fluids. Fans have theorized that these automata represent a kind of intermediate technology, more sophisticated than basic servitors, but simpler than true vehicles that would require actual crew. They're the workhorses of mass casualty events, deployed whenever normal collection methods simply cannot keep pace with the scale of death. The automation extends to the processing facilities themselves. Massive rendering vats operate on timed cycles, their mechanical systems adding chemical agents, adjusting temperatures, and monitoring output quality without requiring constant human supervision. Drying racks for corpse starch production feature automated turning mechanisms that ensure even processing. Grinders and pulverizers run continuously, their hoppers fed by conveyor systems that deliver a steady stream of prepared biological material. The entire system is designed to minimize the need for living workers in the most unpleasant stages of the process, reserving human involvement for oversight, maintenance, and the handling of exceptional cases that fall outside standard parameters. Yet, even with all this automation, the system requires constant maintenance that creates its own grim labor requirements. Servitors break down and must be repaired or replaced. Conveyor systems jam with accumulated biological residue and need to be cleaned. Processing equipment wears out under the constant strain of handling corrosive organic materials. The tech adepts assigned to these facilities spend their days performing the rites of maintenance on machines that are perpetually coated in human remains, their red robes stained with fluids that no amount of cleaning can fully remove. They treat their work as sacred duty to the Omnissiah, but even they understand that they serve the machinery of death in its most literal form. So all those bodies get collected, processed, sorted, and fed into the vast machinery of imperial death management. The servitors haul them in, the labor gangs drag them through the corridors, the administratum tracks every single corpse with obsessive precision. But here's the question that should be crawling through your mind right now. Where does it all actually go? What happens to these billions of bodies once the system has its cold, mechanical hands on them? And the answer, the one that makes the Imperium truly horrifying in a way that transcends simple violence, is that they get eaten. The dead feed the living. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. Welcome to corpse starch production, one of the most grimly practical solutions to resource scarcity that humanity has ever devised. Let's be absolutely clear about why this happens, because it's not cruelty for cruelty's sake. The Imperium doesn't recycle the dead into food because some cackling villain decided it would be fun. They do it because they have no choice. Hive cities house populations that dwarf anything in human history. We're talking tens of billions of people stacked in towers that scrape the edge of space, packed into every available cubic meter of living area. And every single one of those people needs to eat. Every day. Without fail. The agricultural output required to feed populations of that scale simply doesn't exist on most hive worlds. The surface might be toxic wasteland, irradiated desert, or industrial sprawl stretching to every horizon. There's no farmland. There's no pastoral countryside with waving grain fields. There's just the hive, the factories, and the endless hungry mouths that keep the whole machine running. So the Imperium, with its brutal pragmatism that would make any modern ethicist weep, looked at this problem and found a solution. The dead are organic matter. Organic matter contains nutrients. Nutrients can be processed, refined, and converted into something edible. Thus, corpse starch was born, and it's been feeding the teeming masses of humanity for 10,000 years. The bodies that flow into the reclamation facilities don't just get disposed of, they get transformed. Every gram of usable material gets extracted and repurposed. Nothing is wasted because nothing can be wasted. The Imperium doesn't have the luxury of squeamishness. The actual production process is a masterpiece of grim industrial efficiency. Bodies arrive at processing facilities through massive conveyor systems, fed in from the collection points where servitors and labor gangs deposit their endless cargo. The first stage is separation. Clothing, personal effects, cybernetic implants, anything non-organic gets stripped away and sorted for its own recycling streams. Metal goes to the foundries. Cloth goes to the textile reclamators. Augmetics get refurbished or melted down. The Imperium wastes nothing, and that includes whatever the dead were wearing when they stopped breathing. What remains is pure biological material, and this is where the real transformation begins. The bodies get fed into massive rendering vats, industrial-scale cookers that break down flesh, bone, and organ tissue into base components. Heat and chemical treatments dissolve everything into a thick organic slurry, a gray-brown paste that contains all the proteins, fats, and carbohydrates that once made up living human beings. The smell in these facilities is something that workers describe in hushed, haunted tones, a thick, cloying sweetness mixed with chemical sharpness that seeps into your clothes, your skin, your very soul. You never forget that smell. It follows you into your dreams. The slurry then undergoes extensive processing to remove toxins, pathogens, and anything else that might make the final product actually dangerous to consume. This is crucial because bodies don't arrive in pristine condition. Many died from disease. Others carry industrial chemicals, radiation exposure, or the accumulated poisons of a lifetime spent breathing hive air. The purification stages filter out these contaminants through chemical treatment, centrifugal separation, and what the Mechanicus calls sacred refinement protocols. What emerges is technically clean, technically safe, technically nutritious. The key word being technically. This purified organic matter then gets dried, compressed, and formed into the final product, corpse starch. It comes out as dense blocks, grayish-brown in color, with a texture somewhere between compressed sawdust and stale bread. The taste is something most hivers describe as simply nothing. Not good, not bad, just an absence of flavor that fills your stomach without engaging your senses. Some processing facilities add synthetic flavoring compounds or mix the corpse starch with other food sources to make it more palatable. Others don't bother. When you're hungry enough, when you've been hungry your whole life, you don't complain about taste. You eat what you're given and you're grateful for it. The truly disturbing part is how normalized this is. Most hivers know, on some level, what corpse starch contains. It's not exactly a secret, but they don't think about it because thinking about it serves no purpose. You can't refuse to eat. You can't demand better options. There are no better options. So you take your ration block, you chew mechanically, and you push the knowledge of its origins into the same mental compartment where you store all the other horrors of hive existence. The alternative is starvation, and starvation doesn't care about your ethical concerns. Production quotas for corpse starch are managed with the same bureaucratic precision as everything else in the Imperium. The Administratum calculates expected death rates, estimates nutritional requirements for the population, and ensures that processing capacity meets demand. When casualty numbers spike due to industrial accidents, gang wars, or minor epidemics, corpse starch production increases accordingly. When death rates drop, which happens rarely enough to be notable, the system adjusts. It's all very efficient, very organized, very imperial. The fact that they're turning grandmother into breakfast is simply a logistical detail, no different from tracking ammunition expenditure or manufacturum output. Some fans have pointed out the darkly circular nature of this system. The workers who produce the corpse starch will themselves become corpse starch when they die. The people eating it will eventually feed others in turn. It's an endless cycle of consumption, a closed loop where humanity literally devours itself to survive. There's something almost religious about it, a grim communion where every meal connects you to the countless dead who came before. The Imperium turned necessity into institution, horror into routine, and cannibalism into just another fact of daily existence. So, corpse starch handles the protein problem, feeding billions of mouths with the recycled remains of billions of dead. But food is just one output of the imperial death processing machine, and honestly, it's not even the most disturbing one. Because the Imperium doesn't waste anything. Not a single gram of useful material gets discarded when resources are precious and demand is infinite. And human bodies, as it turns out, contain a lot more than just protein. They contain raw materials that imperial industry desperately needs, and the Mechanicum and various manufacturing guilds have spent millennia perfecting the art of extracting every last useful molecule from the endless tide of human remains. Let's start with the bones, because that's where some of the most valuable industrial materials come from. Human bones are rich in calcium phosphate, and when you're processing millions of bodies every day, you're talking about absolutely staggering quantities of this stuff. The bones get separated from the flesh during the rendering process, usually through a combination of chemical treatment and mechanical stripping. Giant vats of industrial solvents dissolve away the remaining soft tissue, leaving behind clean white bones that get fed into grinding mills. These mills pulverize everything into bone meal, a fine powder that has dozens of industrial applications across the hive. Bone meal gets used as a calcium supplement in agricultural operations, though in hive cities those operations are usually hydroponic or fungal farms buried deep in the industrial levels. It gets mixed into fertilizer compounds that help grow the few actual plants that exist in these environments. But more importantly, bone meal serves as a key ingredient in certain types of industrial ceramics and building materials. The Imperium uses something called bonite in construction, a composite material that incorporates processed human bone into its structure. It's cheaper than importing proper building materials from off-world, and when you have an effectively unlimited supply of raw material dying around you every single day, the economics make perfect sense even if the morality makes you want to scream. Then there's the fat. Human bodies contain significant amounts of adipose tissue, and the rendering process extracts this through heat treatment and centrifugal separation. The fat gets processed into tallow, which serves as the base for industrial lubricants, soap production, and even certain types of fuel. In the lower levels of hive cities, where proper promethium is expensive and hard to obtain, rendered human fat gets burned in lamps and heating units. There are entire districts where the flickering light comes from candles made of processed human remains, and most of the inhabitants don't even think about it anymore. It's just how things work. It's just the way life is in the underhive. The skin presents its own opportunities for industrial exploitation. Human leather is absolutely a thing in the Imperium, though its use varies dramatically depending on local customs and the oversight of imperial authorities. In some hive cities, the practice is considered distasteful and relegated to the underhive black markets. In others, it's simply another industrial output, with processed human skin getting used for book bindings, equipment straps, and various leather goods where the origin of the material is carefully not discussed. The administratum has been known to bind particularly important documents in human leather, a practice they inherited from traditions stretching back to ancient Terra. Some noble houses consider items made from human leather to be status symbols, proof of their power over life and death. Hair gets collected and processed into industrial felt, insulation material, and filtering media. Millions of scalps worth of hair gets baled and shipped to manufactorums where it gets woven into products that nobody ever questions the origin of. Teeth get extracted and ground down for their calcium content, or in some cases, collected and used in primitive jewelry and religious artifacts in the underhive communities. Nothing gets thrown away. Nothing gets considered too disturbing to use. The chemical extraction processes go even deeper than these obvious materials. Human bodies contain trace amounts of valuable minerals and compounds that imperial industry knows how to extract with ruthless efficiency. Blood gets processed for its iron content. Organs get rendered down for specific biochemical compounds. The thyroid glands alone contain iodine that gets extracted and purified for medical applications. Adrenal glands provide raw materials for combat stimulants. The pituitary glands from millions of corpses get processed to extract growth hormones and other valuable secretions. This is where the line between official imperial industry and something darker starts to blur. Because some of these extraction processes produce materials that have applications far beyond simple manufacturing. The Mechanicum guards certain processes jealously, and there are persistent rumors about what exactly happens in the deepest processing facilities where even the administratum auditors don't go. Some materials extracted from human remains have applications in servitor production, Others get used in the creation of certain sacred unguents and machine oils that the tech priests consider essential for maintaining the most sensitive equipment. Fan theories about this stuff get genuinely disturbing, with some suggesting that the machine spirits the Mechanicum reveres are partially sustained by materials derived from human processing. The idea that the Omnissiah's blessings might literally require human sacrifice on an industrial scale fits perfectly with the grimdark nature of the setting, even if it's never explicitly confirmed in official lore. What we do know is that the Mechanicum considers the processing of human remains to be a sacred duty in some Forge worlds, a way of returning the Emperor's servants to useful service even after death. The output of these industrial processes feeds back into the Hive economy at every level. The lubricants keep the manufactorums running. The building materials construct new hab blocks to house the workers, who will eventually become raw materials themselves. The leather binds the documents that record the deaths that produce more leather. It's a closed loop of industrial horror that sustains itself through the simple mathematics of massive population and inevitable mortality. The dead serve the living, who will eventually serve the dead who come after them. So you've got this vast industrial machine grinding through billions of bodies, extracting every useful molecule, converting human remains into food and fuel and raw materials for the endless imperial war effort. It's horrifying, it's efficient, and most importantly, it's sanctioned. The Administratum approves, the guilds operate with official writs, and the whole grim process keeps the Hive cities functioning. But here's where things take a turn from merely disturbing into genuinely terrifying, because not everyone involved in corpse processing is working for the Imperium. Some of them are working for something far older, far hungrier, and infinitely more malevolent. Welcome to the world of the corpse grinder cults, where death processing becomes worship and every body rendered is an offering to powers that should never be named. The corpse grinder cults represent one of the most insidious forms of chaos corruption in Hive City society, and they're terrifying precisely because they hide in plain sight within systems that already exist. Think about it from a practical standpoint. You've got these massive operations processing human remains on an industrial scale, and the workers involved are already desensitized to death, already accustomed to handling flesh and bone as raw materials, already isolated from normal imperial society by the grim nature of their profession. They're the perfect recruitment pool for something darker. And chaos, being chaos, never misses an opportunity to sink its claws into vulnerable populations. These cults typically begin with whispers. Maybe a new worker joins a rendering facility, someone who seems to understand the spiritual weight of what they're doing in ways the others never considered. Maybe they start talking about how the dead deserve more respect, more meaning, more purpose than just being ground into starch and lubricants. And that message resonates with people who spend their entire lives surrounded by death, people who've never been offered any spiritual framework for understanding the horror of their daily existence. The Imperial Creed tells them to serve and obey, but it doesn't really address what it means to spend 12 hours a day elbow-deep in human remains. The cult offers answers. Terrible answers, but answers nonetheless. The religious dimension of corpse grinder cults centers almost universally on Khorne, the blood god, the chaos power that feeds on violence, slaughter, and the spilling of blood. But these aren't your typical Khornate berserkers charging into battle screaming about skulls for the skull throne. No, corpse grinder cultists have developed their own twisted theology that frames their industrial work as sacred ritual. Every body processed becomes an offering. Every bone ground down becomes a prayer. The rendering facilities themselves transform into temples, where the endless consumption of flesh honors the Eater of Worlds, the Lord of Rage, the god who hungers eternally for death in all its forms. Fan discussions often focus on how brilliantly insidious this corruption is from a narrative standpoint. The Imperium itself created the conditions for these cults to flourish. By industrializing death on such a massive scale, by treating human remains as just another resource to be processed, the system inadvertently built infrastructure that chaos could exploit. The cultists aren't doing anything fundamentally different from legitimate corpse processors. They're still grinding bodies, still rendering flesh, still producing the same outputs. But the meaning has changed entirely. What was once grim necessity becomes willing sacrifice. What was bureaucratic efficiency becomes religious fervor. And that shift in intent, that corruption of purpose, opens doors to the warp that should never be opened. The internal structure of corpse grinder cults tends to mirror legitimate guild hierarchies, which makes them incredibly difficult to detect and root out. You've got your initiates who handle basic body collection and processing, your adepts who oversee the rendering operations, and your cult leaders who conduct the actual rituals and communicate with whatever demonic entities have taken notice of their offerings. The whole thing operates like a shadow organization layered on top of existing imperial infrastructure, using the same facilities, the same equipment, the same supply chains. Inquisitors who've investigated these cults report that sometimes the corruption runs so deep that entire processing plants have been operating as chaos temples for decades without anyone outside noticing anything wrong. The rituals themselves are exactly as horrifying as you'd expect from Cornete worship. Cultists don't just process bodies, they consume them. Cannibalistic rites form the core of their religious practice, with the eating of flesh serving as communion with the blood god. This isn't survival cannibalism like what desperate hivers might resort to during famines. This is deliberate, ritualized consumption that cultists believe grants them strength, fury, and the favor of corn. Some cults develop elaborate ceremonies where specific body parts are reserved for specific purposes. Hearts eaten to gain courage, brains consumed to absorb knowledge, blood drunk to fuel rage. The theological framework is entirely invented, of course, but chaos doesn't really care about doctrinal accuracy. It cares about corruption, about the slow erosion of humanity, about turning ordinary workers into monsters who have tasted human flesh and found they liked it. The physical effects of prolonged cult membership are documented in various sources, and they're genuinely disturbing. Long-term corpse grinder cultists begin to change, their bodies warping under the influence of chaos energies they've been channeling through their rituals. Teeth grow sharper, better suited for tearing flesh. Muscles develop beyond normal human parameters, fueled by constant consumption of protein-rich human meat. Some cultists develop an actual physical dependency on human flesh, their metabolism so corrupted that normal food can no longer sustain them. They become something not quite human anymore, predators wearing human skin, hiding among the billions of hive dwellers while hunting for their next meal. When corpse grinder cults are finally discovered, the response is typically overwhelming and brutal. The Adeptus Arbites deploy in force, supported by whatever military assets the local authorities can muster, and the resulting purges are bloody affairs that often claim innocent workers alongside the guilty. Because how do you determine who's corrupted when the entire workforce has been processing bodies for years? How do you separate the faithful imperial servant who just did their job from the cultist who whispered prayers to corn while doing the exact same work? The answer, more often than not, is that you don't bother trying to make that distinction. Everyone associated with a compromised facility gets purged, the entire operation gets burned, and the administratum starts fresh with new workers who will probably fall to the same corruption within a few generations. So you've got your official corpse guilds operating with imperial sanction, your servitor processing facilities grinding away under administratum oversight and lurking in the shadows, your corpse grinder cults pursuing their bloody religious devotion to the Lord of Skin and Sinew. That's the official economy of death. the sanctioned channels through which billions of bodies flow every single day. But here's the thing about hive cities that anyone who spent 5 minutes studying them understands. The official systems never capture everything. There's always a shadow economy running parallel to the sanctioned one, always enterprising individuals who see opportunity where others see only horror. And when your commodity is human remains, when dead bodies literally rain down through the hive levels in quantities that would overwhelm any bureaucracy, you'd better believe there's a thriving black market built on flesh and bone. The underhive scavengers are the bottom feeders of this grim economy, and I mean that in the most literal sense possible. These are the desperate souls who make their living picking through the refuse that trickles down from above, salvaging anything valuable from the endless cascade of waste and debris that falls through the hive's decaying infrastructure. And corpses, it turns out, are incredibly valuable salvage. Not just for the obvious reasons, the meat, the bone, the rendered materials, but for dozens of specialized markets that most hivers never even know exist. A single body, if you know what you're doing and who to sell to, can be worth more than a year's wages for a legitimate manufacturum worker. The scavengers operate in the spaces between official oversight, in the collapsed sections and forgotten tunnels, where corpse guild crews don't bother venturing, because the danger outweighs the return. They brave rad zones and mutant territories, toxic sumps and gang-controlled passages, all for the chance to claim bodies before the official systems get to them. And they're not squeamish about where those bodies come from. Murder victims, plague dead, industrial accidents, ancient remains preserved in collapsed hab sections. It's all the same to a scavenger. Flesh is flesh, bone is bone, and credits are credits. The black market for human remains in the underhive is surprisingly sophisticated, with specialized buyers for almost every conceivable body part. Teeth get sold to rogue dentists who serve populations too poor or too criminal to access official Medicaid facilities. Hair gets woven into wigs or processed into industrial fibers for those who can't afford synthetic alternatives. Skin gets tanned into leather for black market clothing and accessories, sometimes deliberately marketed as human-sourced because certain customers find that appealing. Fat gets rendered into tallow for candles and lubricants. And organs, well, organs are where the real money lives. The organ trade in the underhive is absolutely massive, driven by the brutal reality that official imperial medical care is rationed based on your value to the system. If you're a mid-level administratum clerk who needs a new kidney, maybe the Imperium will provide one through official channels. Maybe. Eventually, after years of paperwork and waiting lists that move at geological speeds. But if you're a common laborer, a ganger, an underhive dweller with no official status at all, your only option is the black market. And the black market doesn't care where its merchandise comes from. Scavengers who find fresh corpses, really fresh, still warm fresh, can make fortunes selling organs to underground chirurgeons who ask no questions about provenance. Hearts, livers, kidneys, eyes, all of it gets harvested and transplanted into paying customers desperate enough to take the risk. The success rates aren't great, honestly. Black market surgery in an underhive operating theater, lit by stolen lumens and powered by jury-rigged generators, doesn't exactly match administratum medici standards. But when the alternative is slow death from organ failure, people take their chances. Some scavengers specialize exclusively in the organ trade, developing relationships with specific chirurgeons and learning exactly what's in demand at any given time. They'll camp near areas with high casualty rates, manufacturum districts with poor safety records, gang territories where violence is constant, plague zones where the freshly dead are plentiful. They develop an almost supernatural sense for finding bodies quickly, before decomposition sets in and ruins the valuable merchandise. The best of them can strip a corpse of every usable organ in under 10 minutes, working with practiced efficiency that rivals any official corpse guild crew. But organs are just the premium end of the market. Further down the value chain, you've got scavengers who deal in bulk materials, collecting bones for grinding into fertilizer or construction additives, harvesting hair by the kilogram for fiber processing, rendering fat in crude underhive facilities that produce tallow barely fit for industrial use, but cheap enough that buyers overlook the quality issues. These bulk operators work on volume rather than premium pricing, collecting dozens or hundreds of bodies and processing them in hidden workshops scattered throughout the lower hive. The really creative scavengers have found even more niche markets to exploit. Certain religious cults pay well for specific body parts used in their rituals: finger bones for divination, skulls for shrine decoration, preserved hearts for ceremonies that the ecclesiarchy would definitely not approve of. Rogue psychers supposedly pay premium prices for brains, though nobody talks too loudly about what they actually do with them. Some noble houses in the upper hive have developed a taste for human leather goods as status symbols, paying intermediaries to acquire materials without asking uncomfortable questions about origins. There's even a market for complete corpses, preserved and posed for various purposes. Some buyers want them for anatomical study, training underground Medicaid practitioners who can't access official educational facilities. Others want them for artistic purposes, creating macabre sculptures and displays that cater to the decadent tastes of wealthy hivers bored with conventional entertainment. And some buyers, the ones that even hardened scavengers feel uncomfortable dealing with, want corpses for purposes that nobody discusses in detail, because thinking about it too hard leads to nightmares. The Imperium officially condemns all of this, of course. The Arbites conduct periodic sweeps through known scavenger territories, arresting anyone caught with unsanctioned human remains. The corpse guilds lobby constantly for harsher penalties against black market operators who cut into their sanctioned monopoly. The ecclesiarchy preaches against the desecration of the emperor's faithful servants. But enforcement is spotty at best, and everyone with any understanding of how hive cities actually function knows that the black market serves a purpose the official systems can't fulfill. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody in authority wants to acknowledge. The black market organ trade keeps people alive who would otherwise die, waiting for official transplants that never come. The scavengers who collect bodies from areas too dangerous for guild crews provide a corpse disposal service that prevents disease outbreaks in territories the administratum has written off. The underground economy of human remains, as horrifying as it sounds, fills gaps in the official system that would otherwise cause even greater catastrophe. The scavengers themselves mostly don't think about the moral implications of their work. They're survivors doing what they must to stay alive in an environment that offers few legitimate opportunities. Many of them started as corpse guild workers who got injured or aged out of official employment and had to find alternative income. Others grew up in scavenger families, learning the trade from parents who learned it from their parents, generations of expertise in finding value in the dead. They have their own codes and territories, their own hierarchies and rivalries, their own grim professional pride in work that most hivers would find unthinkable. So, the system works. It's brutal, it's horrifying, it strains every definition of humane that ever existed. But under normal circumstances, the corpse guilds collect, the servitors process, the rendering facilities grind away, and the dead get converted into something useful before they become a genuine threat. The whole machine keeps turning, day after day, generation after generation. But here's the nightmare scenario that every Hive City administrator dreads with a terror that keeps them awake during their meager sleep cycles. What happens when normal circumstances stop existing? What happens when death arrives not in the steady, manageable tide of everyday hive existence, but in a catastrophic flood that overwhelms every system, every contingency, every carefully maintained protocol. Because plagues happen, wars happen, industrial catastrophes, hive quakes, reactor meltdowns, xenos incursions, demonic breaches. The 41st millennium offers an almost endless menu of ways to kill millions of people in very short time frames. And when those events strike, the carefully balanced machinery of death management doesn't just slow down, it collapses entirely, leaving hive cities drowning in corpses with no way to process them fast enough to prevent absolute catastrophe. The most common system-breaking event is plague. Hive cities are basically petri dishes engineered by accident to breed the most horrifying diseases imaginable. You've got billions of humans packed together in poorly ventilated spaces, sharing recycled air and recycled water, their immune systems weakened by malnutrition and constant exposure to industrial toxins. When a serious pathogen gets loose in that environment, it spreads faster than any containment protocol can manage. And the death tolls don't climb in thousands or even hundreds of thousands. They climb in millions per day, sometimes tens of millions, bodies piling up faster than any existing infrastructure can handle. The corpse guilds simply can't scale up fast enough. Their workers start dying too, falling to the same plague they're trying to contain. Collection schedules that normally clear bodies within days stretch to weeks, and those uncollected corpses become breeding grounds for secondary infections, creating cascading waves of death that feed on themselves. The servitors keep working. They don't care about disease. But there aren't enough of them, and their processing facilities weren't designed for volumes this extreme. Bodies back up at every stage of the system, clogging corridors, filling collection points to overflowing, literally burying entire districts under mountains of rotting flesh. When wars reach the hive cities, the breakdown happens differently, but just as completely. Sieges and invasions don't just kill people, they destroy infrastructure. The very facilities that process corpses get bombed, burned, or occupied by enemy forces. Transport networks collapse, making it impossible to move bodies even if you had somewhere to take them. Guild workers get conscripted into militia units or simply flee to safer zones, abandoning their duties entirely. And the combat itself generates casualties at rates that would break the system even if everything else remained functional. A single major battle in a hive city can produce more corpses in an afternoon than the normal death rate generates in a month. The Imperium has emergency protocols for these scenarios, but the word protocol is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. When plague overwhelms a hive, the typical response involves sealing affected zones entirely, trapping the living with the dead, and letting the situation burn itself out through attrition. Quarantine becomes a death sentence for everyone inside the containment barriers, but it prevents the plague from spreading to zones that can still be saved. The bodies inside those sealed zones simply pile up until the plague runs its course, at which point specialized cleanup crews in full hazmat gear spend months or years clearing the accumulated dead. During wartime, emergency protocols often mean mass cremation using whatever's available. Promethium burns, improvised incinerators, even deliberately set fires that consume entire districts along with their dead. Military commanders make brutal calculations about acceptable losses, sometimes choosing to destroy infrastructure to deny enemies the use of corpse-rich territory, rather than letting those bodies become resources for the enemy. Orc invasions are particularly nightmarish in this regard because the greenskins actually benefit from battlefields covered in organic matter, their fungal reproduction cycles accelerating in the presence of abundant biological waste. The aftermath of system failures leaves scars that last for generations. Districts that got sealed during plagues become ghost zones, places where the accumulated dead created such severe contamination that normal habitation remains impossible for centuries. The walls stay up, the airlocks stay sealed, and everyone knows what's rotting on the other side, but nobody talks about it. War-damaged processing facilities take decades to rebuild, and the backlogs they create while offline generate secondary crises that ripple through the entire Hive economy. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of catastrophic failure is what it does to the survivors who have to live through it. Because when the official systems collapse, people don't just wait patiently for rescue. They improvise, they adapt, and the adaptations that desperate people develop during death crises become permanent features of Hive culture, normalized behaviors that persist long after the emergency ends. Communities learn to dispose of their own dead through methods that would horrify them under normal circumstances. Families consume their dead rather than let the bodies attract worse scavengers. Children grow up watching their parents do things that no imperial citizen should ever have to do, and those children carry that trauma forward into futures that never quite recover. So the machine grinds on. The corpse guilds collect, the servitors process, the rendering facilities convert billions of bodies into food and fuel and raw materials, and the Hive cities keep functioning despite death tolls that would collapse any lesser civilization. The system works, more or less, even when plagues and wars push it to the breaking point. But here's the question that nobody in the Imperium really wants to ask, the one that gets buried beneath endless bureaucratic procedures and religious platitudes about duty and sacrifice. What happens to the people who actually do this work? Not the servitors, who have no minds left to damage, but the living, breathing humans who spend their entire lives surrounded by death on an industrial scale. What does it cost them, spiritually and psychologically, to be the ones who keep the whole grim machinery running? The answer is exactly as dark as you'd expect from a setting where hope goes to die. Start with the corpse guild workers, the ones who spend every waking hour collecting bodies from every corner of the Hive. These aren't people who chose this profession because they had a passion for death management. Most of them were born into it, inheriting guild membership from parents who inherited it from their parents, going back generations to a time nobody even remembers. They grow up surrounded by corpses, learning to handle dead flesh before they learn to read, assuming they ever learn to read at all. By the time they're adults, they've processed more bodies than most imperial citizens will ever see in their entire lives, and something fundamental has changed inside them. They've developed what the Administratum Psychomedicae officers clinically describe as death effect dissociation, which is a fancy way of saying they've stopped seeing corpses as people. The dead aren't former humans with names and histories and families who loved them. They're just material, just cargo, just another load to collect before the shift ends. And you might think that's a mercy, that emotional detachment protects them from the horror of what they do. But it doesn't work that way. That dissociation spreads, bleeding into their relationships with the living, making it harder and harder to connect with anyone who isn't also marinating in death every single day. Guild workers tend to cluster together in their own hab blocks, forming insular communities where everyone understands what it means to come home smelling like decay, where nobody asks uncomfortable questions about what you saw today. They marry within the guild, raise their children within the guild, and rarely interact with outsiders who might remind them that their entire existence revolves around handling dead flesh. The psychological toll manifests in ways that the Imperium's limited mental health resources are completely unequipped to handle. Depression is endemic among corpse workers, a grinding hopelessness that comes from knowing your entire purpose is processing the endless dead, that no matter how many bodies you collect today, there will be more tomorrow and more the day after, forever until you become one of the corpses someone else has to collect. Substance abuse runs rampant through the guild communities, with workers self-medicating using whatever they can get their hands on. Obscura, LO sticks, rotgut alcohol distilled in illegal stills, anything that dulls the edges of consciousness and makes it easier to face another shift. Some develop obsessive behaviors, compulsively cleaning themselves for hours after work, scrubbing skin raw, trying to remove a contamination that's more psychological than physical. Others go the opposite direction, becoming so desensitized that they stop caring about hygiene entirely, walking through their lives covered in the residue of the dead because they've stopped noticing it. The spiritual dimension is even more complicated, and honestly, it's something that the ecclesiarchy has never quite figured out how to handle. Imperial faith teaches that the body is sacred, that human flesh was created in the emperor's image and deserves respect and proper treatment. But corpse workers see millions of bodies reduced to raw material, ground into paste, rendered into industrial chemicals, converted into food that feeds the very hive that produced them. How do you reconcile that with teachings about the sanctity of human remains? Some workers find comfort in the idea that they're performing a necessary service, that the emperor understands sacrifice and would approve of bodies being used to sustain the living. They develop their own folk theology, prayers and rituals specific to their profession, asking forgiveness from the dead before processing them or offering small devotions to the emperor before each shift. But others lose their faith entirely, unable to believe in a benevolent god-emperor who would allow such horrors to be necessary. And some, the most dangerous ones, find their faith twisting into something darker, drawn toward the corpse grinder cults and their promises that the dead have meaning, that consumption is sacred, that the Lord of Skin and Sinew offers truths the Emperor never could. The rendering facility workers face their own unique psychological challenges, and in some ways their burden is even heavier than the collectors who at least get to work out in the hive, where they can occasionally see something other than death. Watch bodies go in one end and see useful watch bodies go in one end and see useful materials come out the other, over and over, thousands of times per shift, until the process becomes hypnotic in its repetition. Some workers develop what they call facility fugue, a dissociative state where they perform their duties automatically while their minds retreat to somewhere far away, somewhere that doesn't smell like boiling bone and liquefied fat. They can work entire shifts without forming a single conscious memory, their bodies going through the motions while their minds hide from the horror. It's a survival mechanism, but it comes with costs. Workers in fugue states make mistakes, miss warning signs of equipment malfunction, fail to notice when something goes wrong until it's too late. And when they come back to full awareness, they often can't remember hours or even days of their lives, leaving gaps in their existence that fill with anxiety and paranoia about what they might have done while they weren't really present. The long-term psychological effects create what amounts to a separate caste within hive society. Workers who've been so fundamentally changed by their profession that they can barely function in normal social situations. They develop dark humor as a coping mechanism, jokes about death and decay that would horrify anyone who hasn't spent years surrounded by corpses. They become uncomfortable around food, knowing exactly what goes into corpse starch, even if they never talk about it openly. Some refuse to eat entirely, wasting away because they can't separate the image of processing facilities from the ration bars everyone else consumes without thinking. Others develop eating disorders in the opposite direction, compulsively consuming everything they can get, as if proving to themselves that the cycle of death and consumption is natural, is acceptable, is something they can participate in without being monsters. The Imperium's response to all this psychological damage is exactly what you'd expect. Minimal, inadequate, and focused entirely on maintaining productivity rather than actually helping the workers. Guild members who break down too severely get reassigned to less demanding duties if they're lucky, converted into servitors if they're not. The Administratum tracks psychological casualty rates the same way they track everything else, noting which facilities have higher rates of worker breakdown and adjusting quotas accordingly, but never actually addressing the root causes. Ministorum priests offer spiritual counseling that mostly consists of reminding workers that their suffering serves the emperor and that doubt is heresy. It's not therapy. It's not support. It's just another form of control, keeping the workers functional enough to continue processing the dead without ever acknowledging the genuine human cost of what they're being asked to do. And maybe that's the darkest part of this whole grim equation. The fact that the Imperium needs these workers, depends on them utterly, but refuses to see them as anything more than components in the death processing machine. They're essential but invisible, necessary but never valued, grinding away in the shadows while everyone else pretends not to know where their food comes from or what happens to bodies after death. They carry the psychological weight of an entire civilization's mortality on their shoulders, and their reward is isolation, substance abuse, broken faith, and the knowledge that when they finally die, they'll end up on the same conveyor belts they spent their lives operating. It's a cycle without end, a burden passed from generation to generation, and the only comfort available is the cold assurance that at least the dead don't suffer anymore. The living who process them aren't so lucky. If you enjoyed this descent into one of the Imperium's darkest necessities, consider subscribing to the channel for more explorations of the grim realities that keep the 41st millennium functioning.